In a recent interview, Denis Villeneuve, who is the director of the Dune films, has come out and said that he has absolutely no interest in directing a Star Wars film, and that his interest in Star Wars died way back in 1983 with Return of the Jedi. Villeneuve explains that he became obsessed when Star Wars came out and he was 10 years old. He absolutely loved The Empire Strikes Back, but then states that Return of the Jedi undid all that good work by turning the franchise into a comedy, and in particular, the thing that he despises about it is the Ewoks. He breaks it down to the simple fact that to him at that point, the franchise was stale and lacking in any kind of new ideas. Now that kind of sounds very familiar. It sounds like something you would hear from certain YouTube channels when talking about anything new that comes out for Star Wars today. So let's dissect his claim and delve into the final of the original trilogy films. Is there merit to the idea that Star Wars has been creatively bankrupt since even 1983? And was Return of the Jedi a bad film, or was it more than just the comedy and the Ewoks? Let's start out by just making a mention of the obvious. I think for the most part, Return of the Jedi is considered to be the least popular of the original trilogy films, not because it's bad, but realistically you've got two films that came before it that were just so groundbreaking and pretty much as good as they could have been given the circumstances. Especially following on from The Empire Strikes Back, it was always going to be difficult to top what came before it, so all it really needed to do was end out the trilogy in a satisfying way. The story wastes little time in trying to resolve one of the biggest issues the Empire had ended on, which was the rescue of Han Solo from Jabba the Hutt. Now, Harrison Ford had only signed on to do 2 films originally, and so by the time that they came to film Episode 5, they weren't sure that he was actually going to come on and do the third film, so they had to give him an open ending just in case he didn't come back. Returning to Tatooine was a nice little callback to the opening of A New Hope, and certainly starts the film off with a bang as we get to experience the underworld of Star Wars for the first time. There are lots of interesting aliens. Jabba himself is a disgusting creature who you just instantly hate, and you're very aware of the fact that Luke is a little bit different when he shows up, dressed all in black. He seems more confident in his abilities, he's wiser in his words, and he's prepared to do whatever it takes to save his friend. Ending off with the fight out in the desert was a great way to end Act 1 and set the stage for the rest of the film, similar to how the Battle of Hoth set the stage for the rest of Empire. The whole thing is classic Star Wars space fantasy, and it only takes up the first 30 minutes of the film, leaving a decent amount of time for Acts 2 and 3. Now, Act 2 is probably where the film is considered weakest because it tends to rush through a lot of important story moments, like Luke returning to Dagobah, where Yoda dies and Obi-Wan has a hasty conversation about his point of view. The rebels discuss the battle plan for the Death Star attack, and then we get the travelling to Endor, getting captured by the Ewoks and then convincing them to become allies. All the while in the background we get a few scenes between Vader and the Emperor. Then Act 3 is just as fast paced but full to the brim with emotion as the final battle commences in 3 different locations. The space battle between the Imperial fleet and the Alliance, the throne room confrontation, and then the ground battle on the Forest Moon. And it seems the Forest Moon of Endor is the bit that feels really out of place with the rest of the film. Take the Empire for example. Look at the previous films and how the stormtroopers look relatively imposing, and at the very least they feel like a threat. Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru are scorched in A New Hope, and the rebels are decimated in the Battle of Hoth. I feel like Return of the Jedi is where they lose all of their credibility completely. Being easily outsmarted by the Ewoks whilst fun and symbolic, it makes you question the intelligence of the average stormtrooper, who is supposed to be an elite soldier. The quality of their armour now easily pierced by wooden arrows, and their blasters are now suddenly unable to hit the cuddly bears that were now murdering multiples of these highly trained troopers. It seems to take away a little bit of the tension that's ramping up to the extreme levels in the other 2 locations. The ground battle is a little bit too light-hearted, and the tonal shift threatens to disrupt the balance of emotions that have been building through the film. and it's something that George Lucas does struggle a little bit with. The same thing happened in Episode 1's third act. You have 4 separate stories in 4 separate locations that all had different tones. Consider the wacky battle with the Gungans and how it feels very off when compared with the showdown between Maul, Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn. So I do get what Villeneuve means when he says that he wasn't a fan of the Ewoks. They seem to be a heavy focus in that part of the story. Now, had the Ewoks been Wookiees as was originally planned, I think it would have been a far better fit, but it wasn't due to be because of budgetary reasons, and both George Lucas and director Richard Marquand decided to just go ahead with the Ewoks anyway. But I feel saying that the film itself derailed the entire trilogy is a bit of an overreaction in my opinion. In fact, I don't think that it did at all. Return of the Jedi has some of the most poignant and important moments in all of Star Wars, and where it may have lacked in some consistency, it more than makes up for in emotion and excitement. There's so much fun to be had in the film. Take the Emperor, for example. Every time he is on screen, the music is perfect, helping to set a very creepy and dark tone. Ian McDiarmid pulls off an absolutely amazing performance that makes you feel every lingering fret, and his dialogue is massively underappreciated. I know George Lucas gets a lot of crap about the dialogue in the prequels, and perhaps with some good justification. I think when you look at Jedi, there are some outright great lines with subtle meanings, and a lot of them either involve or allude to Palpatine directly. Take the opening scene where Vader arrives on the Death Star. He informs Moff Gideon that the Emperor is going to be arriving soon.
But he asks the impossible. I need more men.
Then perhaps you can tell him when he arrives.
The Emperor's coming here?
Firstly, you can see the fear in the Moff's face at the mention of this, and that's more great acting, but the gem is where Vader ever so casually mentions that the Emperor isn't as forgiving as he is.
We shall double our efforts.
I hope so, Commander, for your sake. The Emperor is not as forgiving as I am.
I mean, what a line to really set the stage for a character that's even more evil than Vader. There's the throne room scene with the Emperor and Luke. Every line of dialogue by McDiarmid is delivered in such a chilling way, whilst Luke is casually and calmly talking about how he's on what is essentially a suicide mission to make sure that they all go down with the Death Star. And then you've got Vader, who's looking on in disbelief every time his son talks back to his master, who he knows could probably just cut Luke down with no effort whatsoever. The preceding lightsaber fight between Luke and Vader is both visually stunning and emotionally charged, Luke going from reluctance to engage in combat with his own flesh and blood, standing in defiance against the Emperor, to then becoming fully enraged and swinging wildly when they threaten Leia is just perfect, especially amongst the tense backdrop of the ongoing space battle. Speaking of, the Battle of Endor is probably what got me hooked into Star Wars as a child. So much carnage and chaos, ships speeding through space and getting blown up, the Millennium Falcon whizzing through the depths of the Death Star trying to escape the exploding reactor. It's just magnificent and is quite the achievement for 1983. Sure, whenever you cut back to the forest it does seem a little jarring, but the emotion is still there. The fight is still connected and it's paced well enough that you don't lose the momentum from any of the other ongoing stories. And it all ends with the good guys defeating evil, Vader turns back to Anakin and saves his son, the Rebel fleet destroys the Death Star, and all is seemingly well in the world. The only exception to the feel-good theme is with Anakin's death and funeral, and the celebrations at the end do feel a bit short. You don't really get to see the aftermath and are just left to presume that the Empire will now fall without the Emperor and Vader, but it's still not a terrible ending. So sure, you could look on the film as being the most inconsistent in terms of tone, and yes, the Ewoks manhandling stormtroopers is both unrealistic and uninspiring, but beyond that I can't really find much to fault or nitpick. I mean, for me, the film has more emotion in places than either of the other two original trilogy films, and dare I say it, more excitement too, but really it's down to personal preference. I certainly wouldn't say that it derailed the trilogy or the franchise. I think that because Villeneuve was in the position of being just 9 or 10 years old when Star Wars came out in 1977, and then probably around 12 or 13 when Empire came out in 1980, he was pretty much a child for those first two films and viewed them through that kind of lens. Then as a 15-year-old in 1983, he comes to watch Return of the Jedi, and he might have matured a little and started to see Star Wars differently. And after that, you got to remember, it is a film that's set for kids. It's an entire franchise that is based around the enjoyment of, as George Lucas puts it, a 12-year-old. So no matter what he says, Return of the Jedi will always be my favourite of the original trilogy films. And I can admit, it's not the best of the three. I adore it for its strengths, and I forgive it for its weaknesses. And by all means, if Denis Villeneuve doesn't want to direct a Star Wars film, then I think that's his loss. Once again, thank you very much for watching the video. If you've enjoyed it, please do leave a like and a comment. If you haven't, please do consider subscribing and follow me over on Blue Sky. In the meantime, thank you for watching, and I will see you for the next video.